What happens when the most dangerous species in the galaxy isn't the one with the sharpest claws, the deadliest venom, or the most advanced weapons? What happens when that species is the one that simply refuses to play by anyone else's rules? For 3 centuries, the Galactic Council has maintained peace across 12 spiral arms through careful negotiation, strategic alliances, and the unspoken understanding that some species are simply too valuable to lose. But humans? Humans were never supposed to matter. They were the newcomers, the primitives who barely qualified for membership, tolerated only because their little blue world happened to sit on a crucial trade route. The Council made one fatal assumption: that humanity would be grateful for their place at the table. They never considered what would happen if humans decided they didn't want to sit down. This is the story of the day diplomacy died, and the galaxy learned why humans are the most terrifying species of all. Not because they're the strongest, but because they're the only ones willing to walk away from everything when the game stops being fair. Sometimes the most powerful move in politics isn't what you do, it's what you refuse to do anymore. Ambassador Sarah Chun stood at the observation deck of the Galactic Council's primary station, watching the swirling nebula of Andromeda's edge paint the void in shades of purple and gold. Behind her, the emergency session continued to rage in the Great Chamber, voices rising and falling like waves against stone. She had excused herself 20 minutes ago, claiming the need for air, though the recycled atmosphere here was no different from the chambers. The truth was simpler. She needed distance from the madness. 300 years, 3 centuries of careful diplomacy, of humanity learning to navigate the treacherous waters of galactic politics. 300 years of bending, yielding, compromising, always compromising to maintain their precarious position among the stars. And for what? The reflection in the transparent aluminum showed a woman in her 40s, her black hair streaked with premature silver, wearing the deep blue formal robes of human diplomatic service. The stress lines around her eyes had deepened over the past weeks as this crisis had built to its inevitable crescendo. She looked tired, and something else, something that might have been relief. Behind her, the chamber doors hissed open. She didn't turn, recognizing the heavy, measured footsteps of Ambassador Threx of the Vorthan hegemony. The reptilian diplomat's footsteps always carried the weight of his massive frame, each step deliberate and calculated like the species that spawned him. Ambassador Chun. Threx's voice rumbled, his translator struggling with the deeper frequencies. Your presence is required for the vote. Sarah continued staring out at the nebula. I heard the preliminary arguments, Ambassador. I know how this will end. Then, surely you understand the wisdom of accepting the Council's decision gracefully. Your species has much to lose by pursuing this confrontational path. Now, she did turn, facing the towering figure of the Vorthan ambassador. Even after decades of interaction with various alien species, Threx's presence was intimidating. Nearly 3 meters tall, scaled in deep emerald, with eyes like golden coins and teeth designed for tearing flesh, he represented everything the early human explorers had feared they might find among the stars. Instead, they had found bureaucracy. Confrontational, Sarah's laugh was sharp. Ambassador, with respect, humanity has been the opposite of confrontational for 3 centuries. We've accepted trade restrictions that cripple our economy. We've agreed to military limitations that leave our worlds vulnerable. We've permitted inspections that are little more than intimidation campaigns. We've done all of this because we believed in the promise of the Council, that all species, regardless of size or power, would be treated with equal respect. Threx's head tilted slightly, a gesture that might have indicated curiosity or might have been a threat display. With Vorthans, the difference was often academic, and the Council has honored that promise. Humanity holds a seat. Humanity has a voice. A voice, yes, but apparently not a vote that matters. The truth of it hung between them like a blade. The issue at hand was deceptively simple. Humanity had proposed a resolution calling for investigation into the trade practices of the Zephyrian Commerce Guild, the massive economic entity that controlled nearly 40% of galactic commerce. Evidence had surfaced suggesting the Guild was using slave labor on mining worlds in the Outer Rim, species conscripted from primitive worlds that had not yet achieved council status. The human delegation had spent months gathering evidence, documenting the abuses, building their case. They had followed every protocol, respected every procedure, crossed every T, and dotted every I in the labyrinthine bureaucracy of council law. The evidence was overwhelming. The case was airtight, and it was about to be dismissed without investigation. The Zephyrian Commerce Guild provides essential services to 37 member species, Threx continued. Their operations employ millions across 12 sectors. To disrupt their activities based on unsubstantiated allegations would be economically catastrophic. Unsubstantiated, Sarah's voice rose slightly, and she forced herself to lower it. 3 centuries of diplomacy had taught humanity to modulate their emotional responses. Too much passion, and they were dismissed as primitive. Too little, and they were ignored as irrelevant. We've provided visual evidence, testimony from escaped workers, financial records showing the discrepancies in their operational costs. What exactly would constitute substantiation in your view? Evidence that would stand in a proper council tribunal, presented by a species with appropriate standing. There it was, the heart of it. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach, though whether it was despair or something else entirely, she couldn't say. Appropriate standing, she repeated, meaning not human. Threx's silence was answer enough. In the chamber behind them, the debate continued, but Sarah could hear the shift in tone. The preliminary arguments were concluding. Soon, the vote would be called. The Zephyrian resolution would be tabled indefinitely, which in council speak meant killed without the political difficulty of outright rejection. The Guild would continue its operations. The slaves would remain in chains, and humanity would be expected to accept it with grace and dignity. There's another consideration, Threx said, his voice taking on a different tone. The Zephyrian Commerce Guild has expressed concern about humanity's aggressive stance on this matter. They've suggested that continued human interference could result in trade restrictions affecting human space. Severe restrictions. Sarah turned back to the window. The nebula continued its ancient dance, indifferent to the politics of the small creatures that scurried around nearby stars. Are you threatening us, Ambassador? I'm sharing information that may be relevant to your decision-making process. The Guild's concerns are shared by other council members. The hegemony, for instance, has significant contracts with Guild-controlled shipping, as do the Crystalline Collective, the Draconian Reaches, and the Stellar Commune. A disruption of Guild operations would affect us all, and so we look the other way. We act responsibly. We consider the greater good. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching a small transport vessel make its way toward one of the station's docking bays. The ship bore the markings of a human diplomatic courier, probably bringing updated instructions from Earth. Instructions that would tell her to back down, to compromise, to find a middle path that preserved humanity's position while achieving nothing for the slaves dying in Zephyrian mines. Tell me, Ambassador, she said finally, in your species' history, was there ever a moment when the Vorthins stood up for something, knowing it would cost them? A time when you chose principle over pragmatism? Threx's golden eyes narrowed. The Vorthins have survived and prospered for over a millennium by understanding the nature of power and politics. We do not engage in romantic gestures. I see. Sarah straightened her robes, a gesture that somehow seemed to add height to her modest frame. Then, I'm afraid you're about to witness something your species might find quite incomprehensible. She walked past him toward the chamber doors. Threx's massive hand caught her arm, gently, but with unmistakable strength. Ambassador Chun, whatever you're considering, I urge you to remember that humanity's position in the Council is not as secure as you might believe. There are those who question whether your species truly belongs among civilized races. Sarah looked down at the scaled hand on her arm, then up into Threx's golden eyes. Release me, Ambassador. Something in her voice made him comply immediately. And, for what it's worth, she continued, those who question humanity's place among civilized races might want to ask themselves what that says about the current definition of civilization. The chamber doors hissed open as she approached. The Great Hall of the Galactic Council was a marvel of engineering and aesthetics designed to accommodate the widely varying physical requirements of dozens of species. The ceiling soared 40 meters overhead, filled with a complex system of atmospheric zones that allowed methane breathers to exist in the same space as oxygen users, radiation absorbers to coexist with those requiring shielding. The chamber itself was arranged in concentric circles, with the most powerful species, the so-called first among equals, occupying the inner ring. Humanity's position was in the third ring, a placement that had been the subject of delicate negotiation when they first joined the council. Not quite an insult, but far from a position of influence. As Sarah entered, she could see that the preliminary phase was indeed concluding. Chancellor Vex of the Zephyrian Commerce Guild stood at the central podium, his translucent form shimmering as he delivered what was undoubtedly a masterpiece of political theater. The Zephyrians were masters of bureaucracy, their entire species having evolved in a parliamentary democracy so complex that individual citizens required professional advocates simply to vote. And so we see, Vex was saying, his voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics, that these allegations, however well-intentioned, are based on misunderstandings of legitimate business practices. The individuals in question are contract workers, operating under terms approved by their planetary governments. Any suggestion of coercion or improper treatment is not only false, but deeply offensive to the Guild's commitment to ethical commerce. Sarah made her way to the human section, where the rest of her delegation sat in obvious tension. Deputy Ambassador Marcus Webb saw her approaching and leaned over. "Where have you been?" "The preliminary arguments are almost finished. They're going to call for the vote any moment." "I know," Sarah said quietly, taking her seat. "We need to decide on our response. Earth's position is that we should accept the tabling and pursue alternative diplomatic channels." Alternative diplomatic channels. Sarah's voice was flat. "Such as?" Webb shifted uncomfortably. "Private discussions with Guild representatives. Cultural exchange programs with affected species. Long-term economic partnerships that might gradually improve conditions. In other words, nothing." A diplomatic way of saying they would do nothing while looking like they were doing something. It was, Sarah reflected, a very human solution to an impossible problem. Chancellor Vex was concluding his remarks. "The Guild therefore requests that this matter be returned to committee for further study, with input from all relevant stakeholders, including Guild representatives who can provide necessary context for any future deliberations." The polite applause that followed was like the sound of doors closing. Sarah had heard similar applause hundreds of times over her career, the sound of a foregone conclusion being wrapped in the appearance of democratic process. The council speaker, an ancient being from the eternal archive whose species had transcended physical form millennia ago, began the formal procedure for calling the vote. The process was elaborate, steeped in traditions that stretched back to the council's founding, each step designed to lend gravity and legitimacy to whatever outcome the powerful members had already decided among themselves. "The matter before us," the speaker intoned, "concerns Resolution 47291-B, submitted by the human delegation regarding investigation of labor practices within Zephyrian Commerce Guild operations. Before we proceed to final vote, we will hear final statements from any member species wishing to address the chamber." This was it, the moment when humanity could make one last plea for justice, for the principle that the weak deserve protection from the strong. Sarah stood, feeling the weight of 3 centuries of careful diplomacy on her shoulders. "The human delegation wishes to address the chamber," she announced. A ripple of polite attention moved through the gathered delegates. Sarah made her way to the central podium, passing Chancellor Vex as he returned to his section. The Zephyrian's translucent features showed nothing that might be called emotion, but There was something in his bearing that suggested amusement. Sarah reached the podium and looked out over the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. Dozens of species, hundreds of individuals, representing trillions of sentient beings across the known galaxy. The greatest deliberative body in the history of the universe, gathered to consider a question of justice. And she knew, with absolute certainty, how they would vote. "Honored delegates," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. 300 years ago, humanity first reached for the stars. We came with dreams of exploration, discovery, and fellowship among the civilized races of the galaxy. We were welcomed into this council with the promise that here, among these halls, justice would prevail over expedience, principle over profit. She paused, letting her gaze move across the faces, or whatever served as faces of the delegates. Today, we have learned the true value of those promises. Another pause. Sarah could see movement in the human section as her colleagues realized this was not going to be the carefully moderate statement Earth had authorized. The evidence against the Zephyrian Commerce Guild is overwhelming. Sentient beings are being worked to death in conditions that would be considered torture by any civilized standard. Their only crime was being born on worlds that lack the political influence to protect them. Yet this body, this great council of civilized races, has chosen to look the other way because investigating these crimes might be economically inconvenient. The chamber was very quiet now. Sarah could see Chancellor Vex in her peripheral vision, his form shimmering with what might have been agitation. "I stand here today not just as a representative of humanity, but as a voice for those who have no voice in these halls. The slaves dying in guild mines. The families torn apart by guild recruitment policies. The entire species being ground down by an economic system that treats sentient life as a commodity." She took a breath, knowing that what she said next would change everything. For 300 years, humanity has believed that we could work within this system, that we could, through patience and diplomacy, gradually make it more just. Today, we have learned that this belief was naive. This council does not want justice. It wants stability. It wants the continuation of a system that benefits the powerful at the expense of the powerless. The movement in the chamber was more pronounced now. Delegates were turning to each other, speaking in low voices. The speaker was beginning to show signs of agitation. Though with a being of pure energy, such signs were difficult to interpret. "Therefore," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, "humanity withdraws its support for this resolution." A collective intake of breath from the human section. This was not what Earth had authorized. Furthermore, humanity formally protests the Council's willingness to ignore clear evidence of crimes against sentient life for the sake of economic convenience. We call upon any member species with functioning moral compasses to join us in this protest. The chamber erupted in confusion. Delegates were standing, speaking urgently to their aides, calling for points of order. The speaker was attempting to restore calm, while several species were demanding the right to respond immediately. Sarah waited for the chaos to die down, then spoke again. "But we will not waste time on empty gestures. Humanity has learned that our voice, our vote, our moral stance means nothing in this chamber. We have learned that justice is secondary to profit, that principle is subordinate to politics." She straightened, looking directly at Chancellor Vex. "We have learned that this council represents everything that is wrong with galactic civilization, not everything that is right with it." The chamber fell silent. Even the most experienced diplomats seemed stunned by the directness of the accusation. "Therefore," Sarah announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the Great Hall, "effective immediately, humanity withdraws from active participation in Galactic Council proceedings. We will maintain our embassy for administrative purposes, but we will no longer pretend that this body represents justice or civilization." The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the hum of the station's life support systems. Hundreds of beings stared at her, trying to process what they had just heard. Then, Chancellor Vex stood. The human ambassador seems to be suffering from some form of emotional breakdown, he said smoothly. Perhaps medical attention is in order. Sarah smiled, the first genuine expression she'd worn all day. No, Chancellor, I'm not having a breakdown. I'm having a breakthrough. Humanity is finally seeing the council for what it truly is. She stepped away from the podium, then turned back. We withdraw not in anger, but in disappointment. We came here seeking fellow travelers on the path to a better universe. Instead, we found a bureaucracy dedicated to preserving the status quo, no matter how unjust that status quo might be. The walk back to the human section seemed to take forever. Her colleagues stared at her with expressions ranging from horror to admiration. Deputy Ambassador Webb looked like he was going to be physically ill. Sarah, he whispered urgently as she took her seat. Do you have any idea what you just done? Earth will disavow this within hours. Your career is over. Humanity's position in the Council is catastrophically damaged. Sarah settled into her chair and looked out at the chaos she had unleashed. Delegates were standing, speaking urgently into communication devices, no doubt contacting their home governments for instructions on how to handle this unprecedented situation. Marcus, she said quietly, ask yourself this. What good is a position in an organization that stands for nothing? What value is there in a career spent enabling injustice? Before Webb could respond, the speaker called for order. It took several minutes to restore calm to the chamber. The human delegation has made certain statements, the speaker announced. While unprecedented, these statements do not affect the procedures before us. We will now proceed to vote on Resolution 47291B. And proceed they did. The vote was exactly what Sarah had expected, overwhelmingly against investigation, with only 3 minor species supporting the resolution and 2 abstaining. The Zephyrian Commerce Guild would continue its operations unimpeded. As the vote concluded and delegates began to file out, Sarah remained in her seat. She felt strangely calm, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Around her, the human delegation was in crisis mode, already planning damage control, trying to figure out how to spin this disaster. Ambassador Chun. The voice belonged to Kethra, the representative of the Tauri Collective, one of the few species that had voted in favor of the resolution. The Tauri were an insectoid race known for their rigid adherence to ethical principles. My government wishes to convey its respect for your courage today. Sarah looked up at the mantis-like being. Thank you, Representative. Though I'm not sure courage is the right word. Perhaps not. Kethra's translator gave his voice a slight mechanical quality. But it was necessary. The Council has forgotten that civilization is not about power or prosperity. It is about protecting those who cannot protect themselves. As the Tauri representative moved away, Sarah noticed other delegates approaching. Not all of them, but a few. Representatives from smaller species, those who had little voice in council affairs. They didn't speak, most of them, but they made eye contact. A few nodded. Sarah began to understand that humanity's dramatic exit might have consequences beyond what anyone had anticipated. The chamber was nearly empty now, just the human delegation and a few stragglers. Webb was speaking urgently into his communicator, no doubt trying to reach Earth before news of the incident spread. Ma'am, one of the junior diplomats approached hesitantly. What should we do now? Sarah stood, gathering her robes around her. Now we go home. We pack our things, we close our offices, and we go home. But the council will survive without us. The question is whether we can survive with them. As they made their way toward the exit, Sarah caught sight of Chancellor Vex speaking with several of the more powerful delegates. He seemed composed, but there was something in his bearing that suggested the day's events had not gone entirely according to plan. The human delegation's quarters were in chaos when they arrived. News of Sarah's speech had already reached Earth, and the communication channels were overwhelmed with urgent messages from various government departments. The Secretary of State wanted an immediate briefing. The President's office was demanding a full explanation. The media was going insane. Sarah ignored it all and went to her private office. She had one more task to complete before this day ended. The message she composed was brief. To the peoples of Earth, today, humanity learned that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is walk away. We came to the stars seeking fellowship and found politics. We offered justice and were offered expedience. We are not leaving the galaxy. We are leaving an organization that has forgotten why civilizations exist. We go forward alone, but we go forward clean. Ambassador Sarah Chun, final human representative to the Galactic Council. She sent the message, then sat back in her chair. Outside her window, she could see the lights of the great station stretching away into the darkness. Thousands of beings from dozens of worlds, all working together in the name of galactic civilization. And, somehow, she had never felt more hopeful about humanity's future. 6 months after humanity's dramatic exit from the Galactic Council, the universe seemed to be holding its breath. Captain Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the UNSC Defiance, humanity's newest exploration vessel, watching the tactical display that showed something unprecedented in the 3 centuries since first contact, a growing convoy of alien ships following human vessels through space. It had started small. A single Tauri science ship requesting permission to accompany a human survey mission to the Kepler Nebula. Then, a group of Altarian refugees asking for safe passage through human space after their homeworld's government had been restructured by Zephyrian Commerce Guild debt collectors. Now, 6 months later, nearly 40 vessels from 18 different species trailed behind human ships like lost children seeking protection. Captain, Commander Torres approached from the communications station. We're receiving another request for escort. It's from the Deneb Mining Consortium. They want protection for a mineral survey expedition to the Horsehead sector. Elena studied the display. The Deneb were a proud species, known for their technological prowess and fierce independence. The fact that they were asking humans for protection was significant. What's their concern? Zil interdicción, Mom. Apparently, the Guild has claimed salvage rights to several asteroid fields in that sector, despite them being in unclaimed space. The Deneb want to survey before the Guild establishes administrative control. Elena nodded grimly. In the months since humanity's departure from the Council, the Zephyrian Commerce Guild had become increasingly aggressive in expanding their operations. Without the moral voice of humanity to raise inconvenient questions, the Guild had begun claiming resources in previously neutral space, always with some legal justification that the Council's bureaucracy was happy to validate. Send them our standard response, Elena ordered. We'll provide escort for scientific missions in unclaimed space, but we don't engage in territorial disputes. It was the same response humanity had given to dozens of similar requests. In the aftermath of their Council departure, human leadership had been careful to avoid anything that could be construed as military aggression. They were walking a fine line, providing humanitarian assistance without giving the Council an excuse to declare humanity a rogue state. The irony wasn't lost on Elena. By leaving the Council to protest its inaction on slavery and exploitation, humanity had somehow become the galaxy's unofficial protector of the weak and displaced. Ma'am, Torres continued, there's something else. Admiral Chun wants to speak with you. Priority Channel. Elena Straightenet. Admiral Sarah Chun, former Ambassador Sarah Chun, had been promoted to head of human diplomatic operations after her spectacular exit from the Council. Her new title was diplomatically vague, but everyone understood her role. She was humanity's voice in a galaxy that was rapidly choosing sides. Put her through. The main screen shifted to show Admiral Chun in her office aboard the diplomatic station, New Geneva, humanity's mobile headquarters that traveled wherever human interests required attention. She looked older than she had 6 months ago, but there was a strength in her bearing that hadn't been there during her final days as ambassador. Captain Vasquez, I trust your convoy is proceeding smoothly. Yes, ma'am, though we seem to be collecting strays faster than anticipated. Chen's smile was knowing. That's actually what I wanted to discuss. We've been monitoring Council communications, and there are some concerning developments. The The Guild has petitioned the Council to declare human space a zone of economic disruption due to our harboring of what they term economic fugitives. Elena felt her jaw tighten. Economic fugitives? You mean refugees fleeing slave labor? Among other things, yes. The Guild is particularly upset about the Altarian situation. Apparently, those refugees were bonded laborers with outstanding debts to Guild operations. By providing them sanctuary, we're interfering with legitimate debt collection. Legitimate. Elena's voice was flat. Admiral, I've seen the condition of some of these refugees. Whatever debts they allegedly owe, they've paid them in blood. I don't disagree, Captain, but the Council is buying the Guild's interpretation. They're scheduled to vote on the Economic Disruption Declaration within the week. Elena studied Chen's face on the screen. And if they pass it, it gives them legal justification for interdicting human vessels in international space. They can stop our ships, search our cargo, and seize any beings they claim are Guild property. The bridge fell silent as the implications sank in. For 6 months, humanity had operated in a legal gray area, providing assistance to refugees and escorting legitimate scientific missions. But if the Council voted to treat human space as an economic disruption zone, every human ship would become a target. There's more, Chen continued. We have intelligence suggesting the Guild is planning something bigger. They've been consolidating their forces, pulling security ships back from patrol duties. Our analysts think they're planning a demonstration. What kind of demonstration? The kind designed to show the galaxy what happens when you cross the Zephyrian Commerce Guild. Elena was quiet for a moment, considering the tactical implications. Human military forces were advanced, but limited. They had never needed to build for large-scale interstellar conflict. The Guild, on the other hand, had thousands of security vessels spread across the galaxy, all heavily armed and experienced in dealing with troublemakers. What are our orders, Admiral? Continue your mission. Protect the convoy. But, Captain, Chen's expression grew serious. If the Guild forces try to stop you, you're authorized to defend your ships and your passengers. We will not hand over refugees to slavers, regardless of what legal justifications the Council manufactures. The transmission ended, leaving Elena staring at a star field that suddenly seemed much more dangerous. She turned to her tactical officer. Commander Park, I want a full analysis of our escort capabilities. How many ships can we effectively protect if we come under attack? Park's fingers flew over his console. Against light Guild security vessels, we could handle perhaps a dozen attackers while protecting our current convoy. Against heavy interdiction forces, it would depend on numbers and positioning. Elena nodded grimly. The Defiance was a powerful ship, but it was designed for exploration and scientific support, not fleet combat. They carried defensive weapons and shields capable of handling most threats encountered in deep space, but they weren't built to fight a war. Ma'am, Communications Officer Torres interrupted. We're getting an urgent transmission from one of our escort vessels, the Altarian Transport Bright Hope. They're detecting multiple contacts on approach vectors. Elena moved to the tactical display. Show me. The holographic representation showed their convoy, 43 vessels of various sizes and configurations led by the Defiance, and approaching from 3 different vectors, a formation of ships that made Elena's blood run cold. 18 contacts, Park reported. Configuration matches Guild interdiction cruisers. They're broadcasting on all channels. Let's hear it. The bridge filled with the artificial harmonics of a Guild transmission. Attention vessels traveling in formation with human registry ship Defiance. You are operating in violation of Galactic Council Resolution 47348, regarding economic disruption zones. Prepare to be boarded for inspection. Any resistance will be met with appropriate force. Elena looked at the tactical display. 18 heavily armed cruisers against 1 human escort ship and 42 civilian vessels. The Guild had chosen their moment well. They were in the middle of empty space, days from any possible assistance. Commander Torres, open a channel to the entire convoy. Channel open, ma'am. This is Captain Vasquez of UNSC Defiance to all convoy vessels. We are being approached by Guild interdiction forces claiming authority under a council resolution that, as of yesterday, had not yet been voted upon. All civilian vessels are ordered to remain in formation and continue on current heading. Do not respond to Guild transmission or comply with boarding requests. Elena paused, knowing that her next words would either prevent a tragedy or start a war. To the Guild vessels, you are operating under false legal authority in unclaimed space. The beings under our protection are refugees, not economic fugitives, and they have been granted sanctuary under human law. We will not permit them to be returned to slavery, regardless of what paperwork you wave around. The response came immediately. Human vessel, you are in violation of galactic law. Prepare to be boarded, or we will take your ship by force. Elena looked around her bridge at the faces of her crew. Young men and women from Earth, Mars, and the outer colonies who had joined the human space service to explore the stars and represent their species with honor. None of them had signed up to fight a war against impossible odds to protect aliens they had never met. But as she met their eyes, she saw no hesitation. They understood what was at stake. All hands, this is the captain. General quarters. Repeat, general quarters. All civilian vessels. Maximum acceleration on current heading. We're going to try to buy you some time. The Defiance shuddered slightly as her engines pushed to full power. Elena watched the tactical display as the 18 Guild vessels adjusted their approach, moving to intercept. Captain, Park called from tactical. The Guild ships are splitting into 3 groups. 2 groups are moving to flank the convoy. 1 is coming straight for us. Elena nodded. It was a standard interdiction pattern designed to trap fleeing vessels and prevent escape. But the Guild commanders had made one critical error. They assumed they were dealing with typical civilian traffic. Commander Torres, signal the convoy. Emergency scatter protocol. All vessels break formation and head for the asteroid field at bearing 27 Mark IV. We'll provide covering fire. The convoy exploded into motion, 42 vessels suddenly, accelerating in different directions. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos, the kind of emergency maneuver that human captains have been drilling for decades. The Guild response was immediate. The lead group of cruisers opened fire, sending energy bolts streaking through space toward the scattering civilian vessels. Elena felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach as she watched the attack. These weren't warning shots. The Guild was firing to disable or destroy civilian refugee ships. Return fire, she ordered. Target the lead Guild cruiser. All batteries. The Defiance's weapons systems came alive, sending coherent energy beams lancing across space. The human ship's armament was more advanced than most species realized. While humanity had avoided military confrontation, they had continued advancing their defensive technologies. The lead Guild cruiser's shields flared and collapsed under the focused fire. The vessel spun out of control, venting atmosphere and debris. Direct hit, Park reported with satisfaction. Their weapons are down. But 17 more cruisers were still closing in, and the civilian ships were struggling to reach the safety of the asteroid field. Elena watched in horror as one of the Altarian transports took a direct hit, its engine section exploding in a brief star of white light. Ma'am, Torres called urgently. I'm detecting multiple new contacts. Vector 18 Mark 7. Elena's heart sank. More Guild ships? They couldn't handle what they were already facing. Classification, she demanded. Park worked frantically at his console. Contact wait. Ma'am, those aren't Guild vessels. I'm reading Tauri energy signatures. And Deneb. And, ma'am, I count at least 30 ships of various species, all approaching our position. Elena stared at the tactical display as it updated. 30 alien vessels, representing at least a dozen different species, were approaching at high speed. But instead of joining the Guild attack, they were moving to intercept the Guild forces. We're receiving transmissions, Torres reported. From the new contacts. They're requesting permission to assist in convoy defense. Elena felt something that might have been hope stir in her chest. Put the senior captain through. The voice that came through the speakers carried the mechanical undertones of a Tauri translator, but the words were unmistakably clear. Captain Vasquez, this is Fleet Commander Kethare of the Tauri Collective. We monitored the Guild's illegal attack on refugees under human protection. We are here to render assistance. Fleet Commander, this is going to be a shooting war. I can't ask you to. Captain Kethare's translated voice carried what might have been amusement. You didn't ask. We chose. 6 months ago, one human stood before the Galactic Council and spoke truth to power. Today, we stand with humanity. The tactical display exploded into chaos as the newly arrived ships engaged the Guild forces. Elena watched in amazement as Tauri fighters swarmed around Guild cruisers, their superior maneuverability allowing them to strike and escape before the larger ships could respond. Deneb heavy cruisers traded devastating salvos with Guild interdiction vessels, their advanced shields holding against the enemy's return fire. Ma'am, Park called out excitedly. The Guild forces are breaking off. They're withdrawing. Elena studied the display. The Guild had lost 4 ships, and several others were badly damaged. Faced with an organized defense by multiple species, they had apparently decided that capturing refugees wasn't worth the cost. Commander Torres, open a channel to all vessels, allied and convoy. Channel open, Captain. This is Captain Vasquez. I want to thank all the crews who came to our aid today. You risked your ships and your lives to protect beings you didn't know from a species some of you had never even met. Elena paused, struggling to find words adequate to the moment. I am honored to have fought alongside you. The responses came from dozens of ships in dozens of languages, all saying essentially the same thing. They had done what civilization demanded. Over the next several hours, as the convoy regrouped and the Allied vessels took defensive positions, Elena began to understand what had really happened. The Guild's attack hadn't been authorized by the Council. It had been a preemptive strike designed to present the Council with a fait accompli. They had planned to capture the refugees and then claimed they were simply enforcing existing law. But their attack had been monitored by dozens of species who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the Guild's expansion of power. Humanity's dramatic exit from the Council had given these species something they hadn't had before, an alternative to passive acceptance. Captain, Torres approached with a datapad. We're receiving messages from across the galaxy. News of the battle has spread faster than we expected. Elena reviewed the messages. Species after species was issuing statements condemning the Guild's attack on refugee vessels. Some were calling for Council investigations. Others were threatening to withdraw their own trade agreements with Guild operations. But the most significant message came from an unexpected source. Ma'am, we're getting a priority transmission from the Council itself. It's Chancellor Vex of the Zephyrian Commerce Guild. Elena felt her jaw tighten. Put him through. The familiar translucent form appeared on the main screen, but there was something different about Chancellor Vex's bearing. Something that might have been uncertainty. Captain Vasquez, I trust your passengers are well. Our refugees are safe. Chancellor, no thanks to your illegal attack on civilian vessels. Attack. Vex's form shimmered. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. The vessels that engaged your convoy were operating without Guild authorization. Rogue elements that have been reprimanded and recalled. Elena stared at the screen. Rogue elements. I see. The Guild wishes to express its regret for any confusion. We have no interest in interfering with legitimate humanitarian operations. It was a complete reversal, and Elena understood what had caused it. The Guild had expected to face 1 human ship and 42 helpless civilians. Instead, they had encountered a coordinated defense by multiple species and suffered a humiliating defeat. Worse, their attack had been witnessed by half the galaxy. Chancellor, Elena said carefully, I'm sure the families of those killed in your rogue attack will be comforted by your regret. Vex's form flickered. The Guild is prepared to offer compensation for any damages. Keep your compensation. Use it to free some slaves. Elena cut the transmission and turned back to her crew. The battle was over, but she had the feeling that the war was just beginning. Ma'am, Torres approached again. Admiral Chun is requesting immediate conference. Priority Alpha. Elena nodded. Put her through. Chun appeared on the screen, and Elena could see the controlled excitement in her expression. Captain, I've been monitoring the situation. Outstanding work. But I need you to understand what just happened here. This wasn't just a rescue mission. This was a proof of concept. Mong. For 6 months, species across the galaxy have been watching to see how humanity would respond to being cut off from the Council. Today, they got their answer. We don't retreat. We don't abandon those under our protection. And we don't stand alone. Elena looked at the tactical display, which now showed dozens of alien vessels maintaining protective formations around the refugee convoy. Admiral, what are you saying? Chen's smile was sharp. I'm saying that humanity just became the center of a new alliance, Captain. An alliance based on principle rather than politics. And tomorrow, when word of this spreads, we're going to find out just how many species are tired of the Council's version of civilization. As Elena looked out at the stars, she realized that the galaxy would never be the same. Humanity had walked away from the table 6 months ago, but they hadn't walked away from the game. They had just changed the rules. 1 year after humanity's exit from the Galactic Council, Admiral Sarah Chun stood in the observation deck of the newly constructed Humanity Station, watching something that would have been impossible to imagine just 18 months ago. Through the transparent aluminum, she could see a fleet unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed, ships from 47 different species, flying in coordinated formation under the banner of what the media had dubbed the Free Alliance. The ships represented everything from the massive bulk cruisers of the Deneb Mining Consortium to the sleek fighters of the Tauri Collective, from the exotic crystal hulls of the Resonance Worlds to the bioships of the Symbiotic Collective. What they all had in common was a shared commitment to something the Galactic Council had forgotten, that civilization meant protecting the weak, not exploiting them. Admiral, Captain Rivera approached from behind, her footsteps echoing in the vast observation space. The final delegations have arrived. We're ready to begin the inaugural assembly. Sarah nodded, but didn't turn away from the view. Tell me, Captain, what do you see when you look at that fleet? Rivera moved to stand beside her admiral. I see hope, ma'am. For the first time in years, I see hope. I see the most dangerous thing in the universe, Sarah replied quietly. An idea whose time has come. The past year had been a whirlwind of change that no political analyst could have predicted. What began as humanity's moral protest against Council inaction had snowballed into a galactic crisis that threatened to tear apart 3 centuries of established order. The Guild attack on the refugee convoy had been the catalyst, but the underlying forces had been building for decades. Species after species had grown tired of the system that protected the powerful at the expense of the powerless, that prioritized economic stability over justice, that demanded silence in the face of obvious evil. Humanity's dramatic exit from the Council had given these species something they desperately needed, an example of how to say no. The Free Alliance had grown organically, without planning or coordination from any central authority. It started with species offering to escort human refugee convoys, evolved into joint scientific missions, and gradually became something approaching a parallel galactic government. The species involved weren't necessarily the most powerful or influential. Indeed, many of the galaxy's major powers remained loyal to the Council, but they represented something new in galactic politics, a coalition built on shared values rather than economic necessity. Admiral, Rivera continued, the Council delegation has arrived. They're requesting immediate audience. Sarah finally turned from the window. Council delegation? I thought Chancellor Vex was coming alone. Ma'am, it's not just Chancellor Vex. Ambassador Threx of the Vorthans is with him. So are representatives from 8 of the core worlds. This is a serious diplomatic mission. Sarah felt a familiar cold weight settle in her stomach. For months, the Galactic Council had tried to ignore the growing Free Alliance. dismissing it as a temporary aberration that would collapse once the member species realized the economic costs of opposing the established order. But the alliance hadn't collapsed. If anything, it had grown stronger, developing its own trade networks, its own military cooperation agreements, its own diplomatic protocols. The Council's arrival today, just as the Free Alliance was holding its first formal assembly, was no coincidence. Where are they? Docking Bay 7. They're waiting in the diplomatic reception area. Sarah straightened her uniform. Not the blue robes of human diplomatic service, but the simple gray uniform of the Free Alliance command structure. Then, let's go see what they want. The diplomatic reception area was a compromise between human practical design and alien aesthetic requirements. The room could accommodate various atmospheric needs and gravitational preferences, with sections for aquatic species, methane breathers, and others whose biology required special considerations. Chancellor Vex was immediately recognizable, his translucent form shimmering near the center of the room. Beside him, Ambassador Threx looked exactly as he had a year ago, massive, scaled, and radiating controlled menace. The other delegates represented some of the most powerful species in the galaxy, all of whom had previously treated humanity as a minor nuisance to be managed rather than a serious player in galactic politics. Admiral Chen. Chancellor Vex spoke first, his voice carrying the usual harmonic distortions of Zephyrian communication. We appreciate you taking time from your activities to meet with us. Sarah remained standing, a subtle breach of diplomatic protocol that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Chancellor. Ambassador Threx. I must admit, I'm surprised to see such a distinguished group here. I was under the impression that the Council no longer considered humanity worthy of high-level diplomatic attention. Threx's golden eyes narrowed. Recent events have demonstrated that humanity's influence extends beyond what we previously calculated. Sarah's smile was sharp. You mean we've become inconvenient? You've become destabilizing, interjected Ambassador Kress of the Hegemony Corps. The amphibious being's translator rendered his aquatic vocalizations into crisp standard. The Free Alliance has disrupted established trade routes, undermined existing treaties, and created uncertainty across multiple sectors. Sarah looked around the room at the assembled representatives of galactic power. In other words, we've been effective. Admiral. Chancellor Vex's form rippled with what might have been agitation. Perhaps we should discuss the reason for our visit. The Council is prepared to offer humanity readmission to full membership, with certain enhanced privileges. The room fell silent. Sarah felt Captain Rivera tense beside her. This was an offer beyond anything they had expected. Enhanced privileges? Sarah asked carefully. A permanent seat on the Council Security Board, Threx rumbled. Priority consideration for trade agreements. Expanda territorial recognition. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. The Council was offering humanity everything they could have hoped for when they first joined 3 centuries ago. A real voice in galactic affairs, economic benefits, recognition as a major power. All they had to do was abandon the Free Alliance. And in return, she asked, you dissolve this. Free Alliance, Ambassador Kress said. You encourage the member species to return to proper Council authority. You help us restore stability to the galaxy. There it was. The Council wasn't here to negotiate. They were here to buy humanity's betrayal of every principle they had stood for over the past year. I see, Sarah said. And the slaves in Zephyrian mines? The refugees fleeing guild debt collection? The species being economically strangled by trade restrictions they have no voice in opposing. Chancellor Vex's form shimmered. All legitimate concerns that could be addressed through proper Council procedures. With humanity's enhanced position, you would have significant influence over these matters. Proper Council procedures. Sarah repeated the words like they tasted bitter. The same procedures that have accomplished nothing for 3 centuries while species were enslaved and exploited. Admiral. Threx leaned forward, his massive frame radiating intimidation. You need to understand the position you're in. The Free Alliance may seem powerful now, but it cannot survive without access to core world markets. The species you've gathered are mostly minor powers, resource-poor, technologically limited. They need what the Council provides. Do they? Sarah moved to a wall display that showed the current positions of Free Alliance vessels. Commander Rivera, could you show our guests the latest economic reports? Rivera activated the display, showing a series of charts and graphs. Over the past 6 months, Free Alliance trade volume has increased by 400%. Joint scientific missions have resulted in 17 major technological breakthroughs. Agricultural cooperation has eliminated food shortages in 12 systems. Sarah watched the Council delegates study the data. It turns out that when species cooperate based on mutual respect rather than exploitation, remarkable things happen. Temporary gains. Ambassador Crest dismissed. Without access to core world industrial capacity, you cannot sustain this growth. Perhaps, Sarah agreed. Or perhaps the core worlds need the Free Alliance more than the Free Alliance needs them. She activated another display, this one showing resource flowcharts. 80% of the rare earth minerals used in core world manufacturing come from Free Alliance systems. 60% of agricultural products. 40% of energy generation. The silence that followed was telling. The Council delegates were studying the charts with expressions ranging from surprise to alarm. "What are you saying, Admiral?" Chancellor Vex's voice carried a new undertone. "I'm saying that the galaxy's economic foundation isn't as stable as you thought. The species you dismissed as minor powers and resource-poor are actually the ones doing most of the actual work. The core worlds are consumers, not producers." Ambassador Threx's scales rippled with what was definitely agitation now. "You're threatening economic warfare. I am stating facts." Sarah's voice was calm. "The Free Alliance doesn't need to threaten anyone. We simply need to continue doing what we've been doing, cooperating with each other instead of being exploited by you." "Admiral," Chancellor Vex's form was shifting colors now. "You must understand the consequences of this path. The Council has maintained galactic peace for 3 centuries. Without central authority, without established trade relationships, the galaxy will fragment into chaos." Sarah looked out through the observation window at the Free Alliance fleet. Will it fragment into something better? She turned back to the Council delegation. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your offer. Enhanced privileges, permanent Council seats, all the trappings of importance. But you're offering us a chance to become part of the problem we left the Council to oppose. And your alternative?" Threx demanded. "We continue building what we've started. A galactic community based on cooperation rather than domination, on justice rather than expedience, on protecting the weak rather than enabling the strong." The Council delegates exchanged glances. Sarah could see them reassessing everything they thought they knew about the current situation. "Admiral," Chancellor Vex said carefully, "suppose, hypothetically, that the Council were willing to consider structural reforms. Changes to voting procedures, enhanced protections for minor species, stronger oversight of trade practices." Sarah studied the Zephyrian's shifting form. "Hypothetically, the current crisis benefits no one. Perhaps accommodation could be reached." It was a significant offer, Sarah realized. The Council was acknowledging that their system needed reform, something they had refused to consider for centuries. But she also understood the trap being offered. "Chancellor, a year ago, that might have been enough. But we've learned something important over the past 12 months. We don't need the Council's permission to build a just society. We don't need their approval to protect the innocent. We don't need their recognition to know we're doing the right thing." She moved closer to the delegation. "You're here because you're afraid. Afraid that the Free Alliance proves your system isn't necessary. Afraid that we're demonstrating there's a better way to organize galactic civilization." "Admiral," Ambassador Cress's translator carried warning tones. "You're speaking of revolution." "No, Sarakerektiv. I'm speaking of evolution. The galaxy is growing beyond the need for the kind of centralized control the Council represents. Species are learning they can solve their problems through cooperation rather than submission to authority. The room fell silent again. Sarah could see the council delegates processing the implications of what she was saying. This wasn't just about trade disputes or territorial conflicts. This was about the fundamental organization of galactic society. "What do you want from us?" Threx asked finally. Sarah smiled. "Nothing. Absolutely nothing. That's what you don't understand. We don't need anything from the council. We don't need your trade networks, your territorial recognition, your diplomatic protection. We've built our own." She activated the wall display again, showing the current extent of free Alliance territory. 47 species across 12 sectors, with more joining every week. Independent trade networks, cooperative defense agreements, joint colonization projects. We've become everything the Council claims to be, except we actually work. Chancellor Vex's form was cycling through colors now, a sign of severe agitation in Zephyrian body language. You cannot simply ignore 3 centuries of established galactic order. "We're not ignoring it," Sarah replied. "We're replacing it." The silence that followed stretched for nearly a full minute. Finally, Ambassador Threx stood to his full, intimidating height. "Admiral Chun, you are making a grave error. The Council has maintained peace through strength, through the recognition that some species must lead and others must follow. Your alliance will fragment the first time serious conflict arises." Sarah met his golden gaze without flinching. "Ambassador, the Council has maintained peace by ensuring that those who might threaten that peace remain too weak to act. You've created stability through oppression. We're building cooperation through respect. And when that cooperation fails, when species disagree, when resources become scarce, then we'll figure it out together, like civilized beings should." The Council delegation began moving toward the exit, their body language radiating frustration and barely controlled anger. As they reached the door, Chancellor Vex turned back. "Admiral, the galaxy is more dangerous than you realize. There are threats beyond the inner systems, forces that require unified response. Your alliance may find that idealism is insufficient when facing real danger." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Chancellor, for 3 centuries, the greatest threat to galactic civilization has been the Council itself. If there are other dangers out there, maybe it's time to face them as partners rather than subjects." After the delegation left, Sarah and Captain Rivera stood alone in the diplomatic reception area. "Ma'am," Rivera said quietly, "do you think we did the right thing?" Sarah looked out through the observation windows at the Free Alliance fleet. Ships from dozens of species, working together not because they had to, but because they chose to. "Ask me again in 100 years," she said. "But right now? Right now, I think we just told the most powerful organization in the galaxy that their services are no longer required. And if they don't accept that," Sarah smiled, "then we'll find out whether our idealism is really stronger than their pragmatism." As they walked toward the assembly hall, where representatives from 47 species were gathering to formally establish the Free Alliance Charter, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A year ago, she had walked away from the Galactic Council in disgust and disappointment. Today, she was helping to birth something entirely new, a galactic community built on the radical idea that all sentient beings deserve dignity and respect. The assembly hall was filled with beings representing the full spectrum of galactic life. Crystalline entities that communicated through harmonic resonance sat beside methane-breathing arthropods. Aquatic species shared space with beings of pure energy. Humans sat among them all, no more or less important than any other voice in the democratic cacophony. "Delegates of the Free Alliance," Sarah addressed the assembly. "We gather today not to replace one form of tyranny with another, but to prove that tyranny itself is unnecessary. We are here to demonstrate that species can cooperate without coercion, can trade without exploitation, can exist in peace without submission." She paused, looking out over the assembled representatives of 47 species who had chosen hope over fear, justice over convenience. The Galactic Council has ruled for 3 centuries through the principle that power must be concentrated to be effective. Today, we begin an experiment in the opposite direction. That power shared is power strengthened. That cooperation freely given is stronger than obedience demanded. The response from the assembly was a mixture of sounds that no human ear could fully appreciate. Harmonic resonances, subsonic rumbles, electromagnetic pulses, and simple applause. But together, they created something that sounded very much like hope. As the formal proceedings began, Sarah found herself thinking about Chancellor Vek's warning about threats beyond the inner systems. The galaxy was indeed a dangerous place, and there were certainly challenges ahead that would test the Free Alliance's commitment to cooperation over domination. But for the first time in 3 centuries, those challenges would be faced by free beings working together by choice rather than subjects following orders from above. And if that wasn't civilization, Sarah reflected, then civilization needed a new definition. Outside the assembly hall, the Free Alliance fleet held formation among the stars. 47 species united not by conquest or intimidation, but by the revolutionary idea that the universe could be better than it was. And in that moment, watching the galaxy's newest democracy take its first tentative steps toward an uncertain but hopeful future, Sarah Chin knew that humanity's dramatic exit from the Galactic Council had been the beginning, not the end, of their story among the stars.